Welcome to Strive and Thrive. Strive and Thrive is a collection of discussions featuring guests from various fields, focused on guiding entrepreneurs in creating businesses that excel in every aspect: people, planet, and profit. Throughout the series, you can join us, Mike, my colleague, and Romesh, me, as we explore relevant topics with our guests which help businesses thrive.
Romesh and I met whilst I was working as a strategic consultant. I needed a finance director support, and we reached out to him and his team. Since then, we've become good friends and we're sharing our passion for business and entrepreneurship. If you'd like today's discussion and you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel or our Spotify channel, please do. On today's show, we've got Matt Mullan. I've known Matt for many years now, really long time, unfortunately. He's led to a lot of my own thinking about the future. Matt and I have worked over the last 15 years now, nearly, Matt, probably, on some amazing projects stemming from dementia care, digital security, drones, innovation methodologies, AI, and more recently, we've had some fun exploration in the practical application of mushrooms. We spend a lot of time thinking about what are the current signals, what are the big trends, and where the world is moving to. So getting Matt on today is a highlight for me. So really looking forward to this.
Hi, Romesh. Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here. Who knows where this one's going to go? But nice summary of our journey there, Mike.
Good stuff. Well, Matt, we are really excited to have you here today. Look, a futures thinker to me just sounds really impressive and also quite intriguing. Can you explain what it is that you do exactly?
That's a hard one. I mean, that's a challenge I face with my family. What do you actually do, Matt? It's it's not an unusual challenge, but it's quite common for many people in this space. The way I think about futures at a very, very high level is it's really a structured approach to helping businesses envision the emerging trends and dynamics that might affect their operating environment. Okay, so that they are positioned to ask, so what kind of decisions do we need to make today? What kind of actions do we need to make today so that we're more resilient moving into that future? And that's a very, very high level abstract description of the angle I take on futures, which is very, very business focused. More broadly, if we go beyond that, the field of futures thinking and foresight is very, very broad. There's very many applications from the very high level civilizational aspects of foresight. Where is civilization heading? Where are we heading as a world? Dealing with big issues like climate change and feeding that into policy. There are those that are very passionate about using futures to change narratives and take a kind of activist position and create change through that process. And at some stage, the methods and the techniques kind of blur. So it's a bit like the Wild West. But for me, my focus is really on that hard-nosed benefit to business and how do we use these techniques and tools from Futures and Foresight to create impact for businesses.
So that's a really good breakdown, actually. I like the bullet point simplicity. It's quite accessible. You've made something quite complicated sound quite reasonable to understand in terms of what you're trying to do. The thing that struck me there is why focus on business rather than civilization? What drives you towards business in terms of your passion there?
For me, right. So I think it's very pragmatic. Okay, so the whole exploration of the future and the unknown and uncertainty is something that faces all businesses. And in terms of my own entrepreneurial journey, finding that angle on futures, which is something I'm personally that matters to business, is the vehicle for me being able to progress in that space. Now, longer term, I'd like to get into some of the broader aspects of futures and foresight, but in the short term, you've got to earn the right to do that by having the space in the business. And you can only do that if you're delivering impact to the business. So in terms of my journey, and I don't class myself as an expert in the full field of futures and strategic foresight. It's a long learning journey. But in terms of my journey, it's absolutely necessary to bring impact to businesses to set the stage for what comes next.
Got it. Thank you. So how have you ended up in futures thinking, Matt? Tell us about your journey to get to this point, this role within BJSS.
So have you got more than an hour? This is my first question. It's a long story. It's a long story, but it's really an entrepreneurial...
The truncated version, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I look at it in two ways. There's these parallel streams that play out. There's this entrepreneurial journey, some of which I've been intimately involved in with Mike. And then there's this emergence and orientation towards Futures and Foresight as I found that direction. So if I go back right to the beginning, I grew up in Plymouth, went to school between two council estates, very rough, left with 5 GCSEs, became a fishmonger, worked in an abattoir for a while in a very kind of physical, hard labour job, and eventually joined the army. I was going to join the Marines, and there was a concerted effort from family and friends to say, look, you do have 2 brain cells to rub together and you should go into the army and get a trade. So I went to the career office and they said, you have got 2 brain cells. We'd like you to be a technician in the Royal Signals. And so I spent 10 years in the military, gaining technical skills, being in a technical role, predominantly working on tactical and strategic SATCOM. And that was an amazing experience. It kind of laid the foundations for me being able to unlock the potential that's within me that I probably wasn't able to do in the school system. So I went on this journey and suddenly found this rekindling of my interest in physics. And that interest came from a book that I was given at the age of 8 years old, Einstein for Beginners. And I started studying with the Open University, and at just over 10 years decided I'm going to leave. I'm going to go to university. I'm going to study physics. And that was a real experience in change, coming out of the army environment, experiencing the culture change, coping with that, suddenly being a student, but then finding opportunities in that university system. And I made a good relationship with my supervisor, and with some Wellcome Trust funding was able to do some kind of undergraduate research alongside my studies. And that was a formative experience, because that's the first time I was giving a blank sheet of paper and basically asked to investigate something I didn't understand. And it left me there with the experience, scratching my head, how the hell am I going to tackle this challenge? And you coach through it, you find an angle. And the outcome was a set of results that were basically the first known observation of how we template a physical effect in polymer films. Absolutely no utility to it, but nevertheless, that is not something that could be planned. That is not something we foresaw or anticipated. That is something that happened by virtue of the journey that I'd gone on, walking into the unknown. So that's really the earliest seeds here of how do we walk into the unknown? How do we cope with uncertainty? What are the mindsets, the skills that are required to do that?
When was the point, Matt, you learned the emergence and kind of learning and seeing things differently? Because that's one of your true credits, right? Your capabilities.
So that started to come a little later, but the seeds were certainly sown here. And, I need to name my supervisor, Dr. Paul Campbell. I have him down as one of those key people in life who's made a difference. Was a great sponsor. And we talked and touched in that period upon complexity and the fact that the new century was going to be more about biology and complexity than it was about physics. He was a biophysicist. So the seeds were sown, but I didn't really know what that meant. I'd had this experience. I just felt lucky. And then I got inundated with PhD offers, but my wife being a teacher and working very, very hard in that profession kind of needed a break. So I went into industry. So I graduated with my physics degree and I went to Thales as a systems engineer. Had a great time learning about the world of systems engineering on military communication systems. Did well, but very process orientated, very, very structured. And it didn't offer a lot of space for that kind of appetite that I built up in myself in terms of facing those really hard challenges you don't know how to solve. So I started to get involved in more of the futures aspects of some of the military programs that were on. And that was my segue into complexity. It's really an introduction to the command and control research program in the USA and how they were using this thing called complexity science to look at some of the complexity of the environment those solutions operate in. And I started to draw links between that and the way we operate as businesses, kind of at a hunch level. Didn't really understand it, but I'd done well enough to get a bit of sponsorship for the technical director of the business and ask for a different challenge. And the challenge there was, how do we create an innovation culture in this business? Again, it's effectively another blank sheet of paper, because that's a hard
and that's where you are. That's where you are now.
Yeah, well, and then that led to one thing to the other. So essentially, unpacking the complexity of organizations, the human element, discovering design thinking in an early stage, becoming part of an underground movement to grow that in our old company, through to a phase of scaling out across the different locations around the world. And then the final phase was being on the leadership team of a transformation effort, which was really looking to establish the organizational structure for taking a design-led approach to business. And a lot of learning, a lot of wounds along the way. But there's where the seeds of dabbling with complex problems, dabbling with the unknown and uncertainty were sown. Somewhere along that journey, one specific thing happened. We used scenarios to look at a mode of inspiring people in the business. And that was really the first touch point on dealing with scenario planning. And we were looking at things like the total failure of antibiotics. Scenarios like Google or a similar entity owns all data in the world. So they're extreme scenarios. And we were unraveling the implications of that.
What an incredible journey. What an incredible journey. I mean, it just sounds like you're on a voyage of discovery, which is pretty inspiring. And going from a fishmongers to the military, going on to study at university, and then kind of on to these next steps. I mean, what interests me a little bit in terms of what you spoke about there was your reference to your supervisor at university, who it seems encouraged you on that journey. I'm a real believer in mentorship. Mm-hmm. and guidance and trying to help others, with experience that you have. How much of a difference did that make to you? Massive.
And, there are a number of names that I could show gratitude to during the course of that journey. And we had this discussion yesterday when we were working on another topic. I think it's hugely important. It's a core part of who I am now. So not only receiving the mentorship and receiving the sponsorship and the coaching, but now as you progress through life, offering that back, paying that back. But I'm also very, very big on the reverse mentoring. We often think about it as a one-way process, passing on our own experience and our own knowledge. But actually, particularly when it comes to the emerging generations and the future generations, there's so much we can learn from them by virtue of the way they see the world and the experience they've had growing up in a very different world to what we grew up in.
That is a brilliant perspective. I love that.
So it's a dynamic process, isn't it? It's a part of that journey of discovery. And that's pretty much how I see my life, a journey of discovery. Certainly not a journey of climbing the career ladder or even achieving status, because I'm pretty much motivated by learning.
Yeah, brilliant. So going back to futures thinking, what you're doing right now, what do you see as the current drivers of futures thinking? What are the key trends?
Hard one to answer. But if we look at the world at the moment, it feels like we're in a transition. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of information coming at us. There's a lot of false information or fake news coming at us or misinformation. There's a lot of volatility. Okay. And if we look at, traditionally how, putting it back in the business context, how businesses operate, they are wired to seek certainty. And so there's this increasing mismatch between that natural tendency of traditional organizations to seek certainty in the environment they find themselves And that's really setting the stage for what is a set of tools, or techniques, and ways of thinking we can start to grapple with that mismatch. And we can take that right from development in AI. There's a whole host of noise and everything I characterize surrounding that. We can look at the recent election of Donald Trump and the disruptive impact that's going to have. And we can be pretty sure, without knowing the details, that there's disruption coming, that there are unanticipated situations we're going to have to grapple with. And so I think that at the big picture, at the high kind of dynamic level, that's setting the stage for ways to deal with uncertainty.
Are there any topic areas you're really interested in, Matt? Any areas that are really driving you at the moment in terms of curiosity?
AI drives my curiosity a lot. I find it a really, really interesting phenomenon.
Yeah. Because
it's very, very hard to cut through either the marketing posturing, the hype, the myriad of things that might be driving that for many reasons, the polarized views, the camps that are kind of saying that this is going nowhere. It's the slippy slope to the bottom for people who are thinking of investing in AI, to those that are optimistic, that are hopeful, to those businesses that are saying we've got to jump on the bandwagon. What does it really take? Because they may be feeling the fear of disruption, but they don't know what the disruption looks like. It's a really, truly complex phenomenon that requires us to step back and pick our way through it and work out what our own position is on that, or even from a business point of view, what the business position is on that. But get to that grounded position. Where has it got utility? What actually is AI? How is it evolving? How is it developing? And ultimately, how might that provide opportunity or threat to our value chain, or our position in the value chain, and therefore our business model? And that's where it gets down to the nuts and bolts.
Matt, I love that acknowledgement of the uncertainty of AI. I mean, it's obviously the hot topic right now, isn't it? Particularly in business. I was struck by an article I read in The Economist a few weeks ago, which talked about the risk that AI might not produce real productivity gains. It compared AI with the IT revolution of the 70s, 80s, 90s, which talked a great game, and here we are with our laptops and our various applications and suites. But the productivity gains that were promised haven't really materialized. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll step back, and there's lots of questions. What do we mean by productivity? What do we mean by AI? It's a generic term. Yeah. We seem to think that this whole ChatGPT revolution predicated on large language models and generative AI is AI, just because of its presence in the world. But AI's had a long history and a long journey. It incorporates computer vision, machine learning. Back in 2010, I was involved in the cutting edge of biometrics, and there's a lot of AI techniques involved in that. So the first question for me is, what do we mean by AI? Because unless we can gain clarity around that question, how can we answer the productivity question? That's one thing. And then I come back to productivity, and I think, what do we mean by productivity? Because there are plenty of examples now where AI has delivered productivity improvements. And in fact, in some of the work that my company BJSS have done in deploying machine learning in embryology, for example, has led to very, very clear productivity gains. But that's at a macro kind of productivity level, or micro productivity level. Are we talking about macro productivity? And the way we talk about productivity traditionally in the economy, because AI is actually changing, or has the potential to change so much, we might have to change our perceptions of what productivity means at a macroeconomic level.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as an economist myself, that's what I studied at uni. I think of productivity as GDP growth, etc. And I think it's really good that you're challenging and questioning what that really means, and it makes sense.
I mean, there's many systemic factors to that as well, Romesh, isn't there? You know, I mean, if you look at the IT revolution, everything did not change overnight. There is a productivity lag because there's an adaptation of society. There's an adaptation in the business of the skills and the mindsets required to be able to use the technology. Different roles might come on board. And during that period of churn, can we realistically expect productivity?
And how do you see people should adapt to this? A lot of people are talking about how AI can, and it's a good example of Futures and Signals, Matt, here, is AI will create productivity and it will replace jobs and it will change jobs. But for a company that's manufacturing services, anything, how does it navigate that level of complexity and decision making to inform what they should be considering at the moment in the market with what's going on around AI?
So with futures technique, particularly foresight, traditional foresight techniques, we would be looking for the uncertainties that exist now that we can kind of encapsulate. Okay, we would be using scanning techniques to look for the early signs of change that are either driving the ends of that uncertainty or creating new possibilities, and trying to make sense of that to create plausible future scenarios within which businesses will operate.
Can you give us an example? Make it sort of a bit more real.
So I can give an example, trying not to breach client confidentiality of where we've done this with a client who sits in the corporate travel space. Okay. And how there's uncertainty around how corporates will, how the need for corporates to travel will evolve in an AI future. Okay. How they will evolve in a future where it's uncertain whether we'll see fragmentation and isolation for the US, for example, which might be a key market. How younger people entering the workforce might see the role of corporate travel differently. And will we see the emergence of a bleisure type scenario where you're combining and blurring the boundaries of leisure travel with business?
Interesting. An evolution of work from home into travel with work scenario. Right?
How digital capabilities and AI might remove the entries to barrier and increase competition in that market and therefore affect the positioning in the value chain. So all of these uncertainties are playing out. And how do we start to help a leadership team work with those uncertainties to make sense of them? That is an important point here in terms of our approach to futures, skin in the game. Okay, not in the business of creating this really expensive PowerPoint pack that we just deliver as an output. It's very much a participative process where we're engaging leaders in this process and we're starting to process the complexity and generate their own insights. And there's nothing more powerful than your own insight. So in that sense, we're using the future as an articulation of how these uncertainties could play out. They might not. The future is not predictable. Okay. But nevertheless, it's providing a basis for them to think about their business differently.
And I know we started on the conversation on AI, but you've moved on to people, business, travel. You're really talking about it as an enabling piece for the kind of bigger scenario changes that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and you can't boil it down to AI. AI can possibly have, connections to all of those facets. So there is a complexity that can't be separated. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
But what's really important there is in that process then is helping business leaders understand the implications of that to their context. That could look different from one company to the next. That's why there's a lot of effort in framing each of these engagements in the right way. But the implications could be from a point of view of how do we transform? How do we adapt? How do we innovate? What are our options? Because we can't do everything. Okay, so we'll take them through a process of creating some clarity around what they can have agency over.
Yeah.
That agency might be going as far as we see an opportunity to disrupt and we're going to proactively invest and move on that. Or it could be...
I was going to touch on that. We've gone from productivity to disruption, right? It applies in both cases or something around continuous improvement as well. Sits somewhere between all those spectrums of potential.
Or it could be, how are we going? We can't control the market, we can't influence, but what we can do is keep an eye on that and be reactive. So what are we going to do to set ourselves up to be as reactive as possible if certain realities play out? And there's a great example of that in Shell. It's a classic in the scenario planning space. How Shell had used some of these techniques strategically within their organization, and had explored the scenario where the oil market basically moves from a buyer's market, where the buyers can really influence the price of oil, to a seller's market. OPEC get their act together and start to take control of that. And the potential for that to lead to all sorts of complexities, but an oil shock. And they had basically wargamed that scenario. And through that process, had a very, very good idea of what to look for if that scenario was actually happening. And it did happen. And because they'd effectively rehearsed that future, they were ready to react early and take an advantageous position. And there's a lot more detail to that story, but that's it in a nutshell. It primed them to be ready for something that might not have happened. But the very fact they rehearsed the future, they were ready to react and seek the benefits.
And do you think we talk a lot about entrepreneurs and helping them on the journey of trying to understand the future. Do you think it's the macro effects, which a lot of people spend time talking around, COVID-19, AI, climate change, or do you think it's micro effects that are more important to those specific businesses like travel or computing businesses or manufacturing companies?
It depends on their area of focus. You can pitch this at both levels. Typically, you can't ignore the macro effects. So that's kind of the drivers, the established trajectories of change that are playing out in the world, like climate change, for example. But you can turn it around and you can start to say, right, for our business, what emerging developments can we anticipate that might make an impact? Okay, and AI, this is particularly interesting in the AI space because we're all caught in the large language model paradigm and the hype around that. But there's very little attention on the breakthrough innovations that will give us the second generation of that AI, the new computing paradigms, the new ways of computing, for example. Okay,
Matt, can I just jump in there? We spoke earlier in the week, and you talked about large language models and how it could impact future iterations of AI, and I loved your high-level kind of overview of what an LLM is, and why in some ways it could be maybe holding back the development of AI. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'll be careful. There are people in the business better positioned to talk in depth about AI, but my interpretation of a large language model is essentially a very sophisticated statistical model that can spot patterns in language and text, therefore infer a response to a question. And the really important point of our conversation that we had is that there is no understanding behind that, as there would be if a human intelligence was tackling that problem. There is a mathematical algorithm that's looking for patterns and presenting those patterns. It doesn't believe its output. It actually doesn't lie. It just creates an output from a model. And when you look at it that way, we can start to actually move away from our tendency to think of it as a human intelligence. Intelligence is a bit of a red herring here. It's a different type of intelligence. It's looking to simulate human intelligence, but it's a simulation. And that allows us to really not trust its output, understand the nature of its output, and use it in a different way. Yeah. So that's how I see large language models. And I'm sure there's some experts out there that would build on that or maybe challenge that. But that's perhaps not how a lot of society is seeing these large language models.
Yeah. I think it's crucial to understand what you've just explained, because AI, for me, as a layman, kind of implied, sentient intelligence, machine learning, all of these phrases, but we're not there yet.
We're a long way from it. But nevertheless, there are strong commercial imperatives. There are very powerful drivers behind the current generation of generative AI, for sure, which are driving some of that hype. mainly because it needs a return. But there are also very, very serious scaling limits towards, impeding how far the current generation can go. And so back to what you were saying about an article I read, if we're going to move towards a more advanced form of artificial intelligence and maybe start to touch upon general artificial intelligence or super intelligence, then we will need to move beyond the current obsession with large language models. But ironically, the current obsession with those large language models and generative AI in general has probably set back the advance towards something like generative AI by 5 years or more. And so this is what I'm saying about the complexity of this AI world. You've got the hype layer, the really simplistic pop messages that are out there. But when you start to dig down, it starts to look more interesting. And that's ignoring the ethical angles on this, the impact it can have on the way we think as humans, so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, thank you. That's so interesting and kind of helps break down where we are with AI, I think, in a way that's really accessible and certainly alters my understanding of AI. And listen, I've got to ask this question because we hear about this in the media all the time. Is AI, in your opinion, an existential threat?
Gut reaction is not yet. Okay. And if it was, it wouldn't be from the perspective that we tend to think about that, a sentient AI going around killing humans or taking control of humans.
Terminator-esque.
Yeah. But could it, the question that sits in my mind, could it be an existential threat from the point of view of the way humans exploit it and deploy it carelessly? That's a different question. Could it be an existential threat in terms of the bigger picture, an arm race that's maybe going on at a geopolitical level, and how it starts to create state-type capabilities that can be used in that context? Not something that typically comes in the business-type conversation, and not something we see a lot on. Could we see, AI doing what it does without intelligence, as we see it as humans, impacting aspects of the critical infrastructure and creating catastrophes? Maybe. Can we see AI polarizing society? I think we're already seeing it in terms of the way AI is used in social media platforms. So whether that, without doubt, it's going to have an impact on society and the way society evolves. Whether that becomes existential or not remains to be seen. But I don't think we're anywhere near a rogue AI taking control, developing its own sentience, getting ready to go on a rampage and wipe out humanity in that fashion.
So Cyberdyne Systems isn't quite there yet then.
But it's interesting again.
Movie reference there.
I've not seen
the question I wanted to touch on though, because that's good, Matt, because you're giving the lens out right on the current narratives. But actually, there is a threat to many businesses today with even the existence of the capabilities within LLMs right now, in that they're able to, their competitors, are able to do things much more quickly, much more effectively. There's productivity opportunities. What's your view on kind of how that should be navigated? Because they're people shouldn't be listening to this and going, it's not there yet. There's big changes in there right now and signals an opportunity for people right now that they really need to be starting to think about and watch.
Undoubtedly, there are benefits from AI and generative AI. Yeah. And that's where BJSS, in some areas specialize, because how do you help those companies take advantage of those advantages? And what we see a lot is that there's more to being able to take advantage than meets the eye. And many businesses think, right, AI is the solution to everything. I'm going to become more productive and streamlined overnight. But the underlying data they've got in the business is not in the right shape. There's a lot of work to be able to get the data set up for AI to be able to deliver those benefits. And for many companies, not all, but for many, particularly small companies, they're missing the underlying work that's got to be done to position the company to get the best out of current generations of AI. So undoubtedly the benefits are there, but there's a lot of work to be done in terms of thinking about data, structuring of data, data strategy, how that impacts workflows in an organization, how that's related to what the organization is trying to achieve, its core mission, so on and so forth, in order to get the best out of the current technology.
Matt, are there any kind of high-level recommendations, but based on exactly what you said, they're practical recommendations that a small company might think about doing to kind of strengthen its collection of relevant data? What would you, is there something? Are there some more straightforward steps they can do to get the ball rolling in that area?
I think for a small company, it might well be operating on, some sort of cloud services, which by nature will offer some of that structure. It's not a space I would want to. It's not my role, so I'm not going to kind of pretend to be able to answer that one effectively. What I would say is that looking at it from a futures and foresight point of view and an uncertainty point of view, okay, it's really grappling with the uncertainties that presents to a business in terms of why you want to use AI. And if you're sure that AI is an absolute essential, then you need to engage the right experts to really start understanding how that can be implemented. For a small company, I think it's probably less complex than a big company that's maybe got various locations, an IT estate, a vast data estate that extends beyond many different business lines within a business, for example. So for a small company, I don't know. I think it's important that they think about, if they're moving into an AI future, how and what's required for a small company to get on top of its data so that they're ready to move on it. They can anticipate and be ready to move.
Interesting. You've touched on a couple of interesting methods here, Matt. Plausible futures, scanning, signals. You mentioned storytelling narratives earlier in the conversation. Those are kind of theories, right? But how do you see sort of someone who's setting up their own business, got a vision, how do you see them using these types of tools to really help them sort of navigate that journey as they begin to build a new business, product, service?
So I think keep it simple is my first advice here. You can have a vision, and often entrepreneurs get fixated on their vision, and they're very motivated.
I thought that was where you're going.
But the environment in which you execute achieving that vision changes. New things are happening all the time. And some of that change can present opportunity, some of it can present threat. And in pulling the blinkers on in pursuit of the vision, we can be blind to some of that change. So one simple thing is to ask, how can I just keep looking outside of my current trajectory and be sensing for any changes or signs of change that might impact my vision or my ability to execute that vision. You can focus that even more. Are there any uncertainties that I face in pursuing that vision that maybe I'm not focused on? Maybe because traditionally in business, we focus on the risks, those things that can be recognized and quantified in terms of a probability of impact, and the severity of impact, for example. But an uncertainty, you can't. You don't know the likelihood or what way an uncertainty is going to play out. But what you can do is you can turn those into known unknowns. And then you can start to use very basic scenario planning type questions like, what if? What if the uncertainty plays out in this way? What have I got to consider? So at a very, very personal level, you're starting to process those uncertainties. And of course, you can get more structured, more advanced. You can do deeper scanning. That takes more and more effort for an individual entrepreneur. Maybe just thinking at that level and thinking about the different scenarios you face and what it means to your vision could be quite useful, because it could provide you the basis on which to go, you know what, I need to pivot my vision towards something else. Or
I've got I got two really good examples. You know of one. I worked in the drone industry, and we were waiting for policy change, and it didn't change, and the wind didn't change in our favour, right? And so that was an interesting experience. But also at the moment we're working in biodiversity, and we've got an assumption on what the market will do, what government policy will look like. But actually, we've got to be nascent to that and aware that this could evolve in a very different direction and be cognizant of those changes. But I think the interesting thing that working with you and talking to you about this for me is that actually go and play in that space too, because you can influence it. It's not just about waiting for the macro changes to evolve. It's be part of the discussions, be part of the engagement process to sort of stimulate it.
And that's a really, really important point here, because ultimately it's all about action. In whatever form action comes in the here and now. And so influencing is an action. And that's where you can start to create agency for yourself. That's where you have the ability to do something that could shift or influence the direction of policy, for example. And so you're starting for the process to identify those areas where your action can help influence the outcomes.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to the principle that, the futures we envision and the way we act today can often contribute to the way the future actually turns out. So it's not just about reaction and responding and looking for those threats. It's about also having clarity around the small actions you can take today to move forwards. And in moving forward, you start to create the future.
You can steer, you can bend future to your desired path. That's really, really interesting. I love the scenario planning aspect. I mean, come on, I'm a finance director. I do a lot of modeling, etc. With my clients and kind of trying to plot the future. It's so important to be able to prepare for different scenarios. I suppose in your case, you're attacking that space in the same way, but with a different knowledge base, a different skill set. The power in that must be incredible, in terms of what you might be able to predict. For example, are you able to spot different patterns in analysing lots of scenarios? Is that something you come across?
So let's just step back. Predict. I don't use the word predict. The future is not predictable. Okay, the future is not real. It hasn't happened yet. Okay, so therefore we can't analyze the future because there's no data. And if we look at what, especially in the finance director space, we're typically looking at historical data, looking for extrapolations, patterns to infer meaning from that. And they are more predictive in nature. Okay, and they're predominantly there to either create comfort through the illusion of stability, or to address the absolute need for many organizations to seek stability. Okay, nevertheless, because the future hasn't happened, and because there are many, many things playing out that influence how the future actually plays out, it's probably healthier to broaden the perspective beyond what we think we can predict on historical data, and look for the seeds and signs of change that indicate various different futures might play out, and deploy our imaginations to work out what they would look like, and then ask what if those play out. And that would then bring a much different way of thinking to how to move a business forward. And if you do that, back to your pattern question, if you do that at scale across many scenarios, you might spot patterns emerging across many different diverse scenarios. And they're particularly interesting. Why do they keep emerging? Why do we keep seeing these patterns? Are they something that's worthy of exploring further? Do they indicate something that we think is more likely to play out regardless of the actual details of the future?
Do you have any examples of such patterns that you would be able to speak about?
Right. So I'll tell you one I picked up on another podcast was around 9/11. Okay. And it's an example of a pattern that wasn't picked up. Okay. There were many signs in the signals and the chatter that an event was going to happen in the future. across many agencies in the US. And because the agencies weren't talking and they didn't join up the dots, they weren't able to infer this big event is coming. Okay, so that's an example where there's a failure, even though the signals existed. Now, imagine had the dots been joined up, it would have been possible potentially to have mitigated that catastrophic event on 9/11.
No.
So that's a classic example that's talked about.
Yeah.
There's a couple of good ones, right? Like Blockbuster, sort of, and it's not seeing the bigger game, the Kodak moment. There's a lot of sort of in innovation theory. Those are the two big rolled out examples. But do you think it's that blocker? It's like there's something psychological in this game about people having a vision and a model and an existing paradigm, and not being able to see those signals and not being open to kind of looking beyond their vision of where they're going at the moment.
Absolutely. And I think then that talks to the importance of narratives and mainstream narratives we tell ourselves about business. So when we talk about visions, we often talk about the vision, mission. For many, there's this established kind of MBA way of thinking of how you do strategy, how you move. And it's a narrative that's implanted in our heads. But actually using some of these techniques enables us to change those narratives, to challenge those narratives, and maybe start to think about different ways of moving forward, different ways of thinking. And that's the deeper level of using futures as a tool. It's really about changing the way we think, challenging our perceptions of how things should be done, challenging our own biases and assumptions, and giving ourselves the best opportunity to ask, what if?
I love that. There's a key phrase in there for me. Well, one takeaway firstly is broadening horizons, right? When you're thinking about the future, when you're looking at potentialize, keep those horizons broad, and then step back away from potentially a narrow vision. So that's a key message I'm getting here. Strengthening your assumptions, that's, I think, absolutely key. Certainly in my world where we're looking at a financial projection, you're absolutely right, Matt, in your earlier comment. Of course, we will use as a base kind of past performance, because that's certainty, that's data we have. However, if we're doing our job properly, you've got to interrogate the assumptions that are driving the kind of predictions for the future. And the more you can interrogate that, and perhaps building in, that broadening horizon, building in deeper scenario analysis, kind of strengthens those the ability of those models to predict outcomes.
And again, I'd challenge the word predict. To what extent we can actually predict is to be challenged. But exactly,
surely you're challenging accurately predict, because predict is just a verb, isn't it? It's not necessarily saying you're going to do it accurately.
Perhaps better to use forecast. The weather's a great analogy. Yeah, we forecast the weather. Often it's not right. Whereas if we predicted the weather, we'd be saying the weather is going to be sunny
There's
tomorrow.
more element of certainty in that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's false.
A fair comment. Yeah.
But back to your point about the baseline, there's a great model in futures called the futures cone, and getting past the debate of whether it's a good model or not. I'm very pragmatic. It has some utility. The projected future, that one with absolute certainty, is the center line. Okay. Then often, especially in the finance director world, there'll be error bounds around that. So that's what we call a normative future. That's the future we think is going to happen. That's the future we tend to plan around. But beyond that, there's a whole lot of knowledge out there that tells us that there's a much broader range of possible futures that could happen. Beyond that, there's a whole range of plausible futures that could happen if we develop new knowledge. Beyond that, there's a whole range of preposterous futures that can happen. And the only difference between that and the others is our belief system. What's preposterous for me isn't preposterous for you. Okay. So they're very, very useful futures for really, really challenging and disturbing mindsets and creating that shift in thinking and getting to the assumptions. But it's just a model. It's not like a light cone in physics, which is based upon empirical data. It's just a model to help us think about what those different futures look like And the very fact that I said what's preposterous to me and what's preposterous to you is different means that the eye that's looking through that cone needs to be diverse. We need different people with different backgrounds, different ways of thinking, engaging in these futures activities. Not just a bunch of finance directors looking at finance data, all the same type of thinking, same type of training. Maybe that needs to be diversified, and you need to bring in the different ways of thinking in order to create a more resilient financial strategy. And that's where some of these techniques can be used to stress test the outcomes that you talk about.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's really important to bring in lots of different perspectives when you are trying to plan for the future. It would be crazy not to do that. And I think I fully support that point.
We're coming towards the end, Matt, so I'm going to ask you one final question. 2 parts to it. What worries you most for the future, and what inspires you most for the future? I've got my cone out looking, right? Give me something in it. Yeah.
Well, I can tell you what worries me most, and it's in that domain of where is social media going next, and that plays into AI as we use it more and more as a population, and how is that shaping how we think about the world? How is that influencing society? Either organically and not by design, but more importantly by design. And who are the powerful stakeholders who might be using those levers to shift perceptions in society, to control society, to create election outcomes, and so on and so forth? And I think we've learned a lot from social media. There's a lot of questions to ask about this next revolution in AI as it grows, the impact that's going to have.
Interesting. I like that one.
Yeah.
What about inspires you? What inspires you?
Oh,
Gives you faith? What?
Humans. Despite all of this, and despite everything we talk about, historically, we've had a habit of coming out the other side somehow. Yeah. I've talked a lot about uncertainty. Very, very careful not to fall into the uncertainty trope where, you hear the message uncertainty is increasing all the time. We've never faced such uncertainty in our life. There's been periods in history, there's been huge uncertainty for society. There's been periods where societies have gone through massive change. Second World War is a great example. Okay, the Industrial Revolution, and somehow we come out the other side. So I do have optimism and hope that collectively as humans, we can get over these challenges that we face, especially as technology starts to have more and more of an impact on society.
Good. Really good.
Excellent. That's a good way to kind of end the kind of the Q&A element. And Matt, thank you so much. I mean, the takeaways I think I've gotten from this, there's so much in here to unpack actually, but I guess some of the messages I've got kind of consider deeply scenario planning within your business to help navigate uncertainty. Look for patterns that might emerge, broaden your horizons, and be open to lots of possibilities. I think if you're a smaller business, look at sorting out your underlying data sets so that you can engage and employ AI effectively going forwards. And something that you said, Matt, that I totally believe in is keep it simple. Keep it simple. I think.
And pragmatic.
Message. Yeah.
We can get so wrapped up on the theory and arguments about theoretical models and so on and so forth. But what really matters is, can they be deployed to have utility and practical effect? Do they move us forward?
Amazing.
Yeah. I'm in the same sort of space. It's interesting. I'm going to use the word predicting here, even over the debate. But I think it's not about predicting the future, right? It's about understanding what's in the present and what that you have as ability as an individual to action and shape. Action might be get in there and inform the policy, or action might just be spend your time thinking more broadly about what's going on out there and those types of things that might influence you as an individual, as you as a business, as you as an organization, as you as a product development team, whatever it might look like. And I think for me, action is probably bizarrely the biggest insight here, right? Get going, get doing it, rather than just sort of wait for things to happen almost and think that things will happen and fall into place magically.
And I'll just add to that, Mike, by posing a challenge. Action, massively important. blind action versus action with foresight. Two different things.
Very good. Nice summary.
Absolutely. And so we're gonna wrap up there. I hope all of our viewers and listeners enjoyed that. Thank you very, very much for listening. And a massive thank you to Matt. That really was an excellent discussion. I really enjoyed it. Strive and Thrive is currently a monthly series, and we have a great pipeline of interesting people to share their insights with you. Our next session is on the 13th of February, and we're going to share details about that in social media over the next few weeks. We're now on YouTube and have a podcast on Spotify as well. So please do look us up. As well as thanking Matt, I'd like to thank Mike and the rest of the Strive and Thrive team. So see you all next time.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Romesh.
See you both. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.